have said that this is your passion project. I've read some interviews where you said that this is your passion project. I'm going to get into specifics now because जो ये 90 second का teaser है उस पे हर एक frame पर debate चल रहा है. There is an image of Saif Ali Khan as Ravan who is sitting. चल रहा है. जी, जी, please आप बोलिए उसके बाद मैं सवाल पूछूंगी.
No, I just wanted to say that not every frame isn't debated because that's not the case. I mean, the dialogue that we had in the trailer, धस जाए धरती चटक जाए आकाश, न्याय के हाथों होकर रहेगा अन्याय का सर्वनाश. आ रहा हूँ मैं अधर्म का विध्वंस करने, आ रहा हूँ न्याय के दो पैरों से अन्याय के 10 सर कुचलने. I think these are the lines which Manoj have written, which are extremely, we are so proud of these lines. We are extremely proud of these lines. And when you see them in the film, it's a huge monologue that Prabhu Shri Ram's character played by Prabhas delivering. These are the things that we want to be proud of. These are the things that we would like to talk about. These are the things that we want to would like to have the conversation with, and not about some things which we don't agree with.
Okay, so then how are you looking at some criticism? Let me ask those criticisms and then we'll go ahead with the conversations that you want this trailer to generate. There is one image of Saif Ali Khan as Ravan who is sitting on a mystic bird. There are scholars, historians who are of the opinion that in Ramayana there is no description that of any kind of bird of this nature.
Sure. So he's demonic, right? He is Mayavi. He is a person who is the greatest villain of all time.
In his lust for victory, is the Russian President Vladimir Putin losing ground in Ukraine's war? And is Russia's nuclear threat real? And what has India got to gain by abstaining on a Unhrc vote against China? Hello and a very warm welcome to World 360. I'm Akanksha Swaroop. Now we'll try and answer these questions, but first up are the headlines. Ukraine's President Zelensky warns that Russians are being prepared for nuclear war, but also adds that Russia is not ready to use them. Earlier, the US president had cautioned of an Armageddon if Putin uses a nuclear weapon to win Ukraine's war. India abstains from voting against China on a draft resolution in the UNHRC on the human rights situation in Xinjiang. India's MEA stresses that country-specific resolutions have never helped in dealing with human rights violations. After its 6th missile launch in 2 weeks, North Korea calls them self-defense against US military threats. The US fears that North Korea is building up to its 7th nuclear test. And the 2022 Nobel Peace Prize awarded to human rights advocate Alice Bialyatsky from Belarus, the Russian Human Rights Organization Memorial, and the Ukrainian Human Rights Organization Center for Civil Liberties. It's been over 220 days of Russia's war in Ukraine, and Ukraine's offensive is pressing ahead in regions that Russia claims to have annexed. President Zelensky has said that forces have retaken, or rather reclaimed, more than 500 square kilometers of territory in the southern Kherson region since October 1st. This essentially implies that Putin's plan to annex certain areas of Ukraine is not going as planned, indicating that a Russian victory is a distant dream at the moment. Putin's birthday was also a low-key affair, which was yesterday. And on World Teachers' Day on October 5th, Putin announced changes to his partial mobilization drive, saying that he would delay drafting additional categories of students, including those enrolled at accredited private universities and certain postgraduate students. Meanwhile, shocking visuals have also arrived to the fore of Russia's bridge to Crimea being blown up. Apparently, a truck laden with explosives was used to blow up this Crimean bridge. Now, let me also tell you that CNN News 18 is one of the few channels which have somebody covering this war from ground zero, and to do that for CNN News 18 is my colleague Sanjay Suri, reporting live from Kiev. Sanjay, to address the following, let's also talk about the latest position on the ground level. What does the bridge explosion in Crimea mean for Russia?
Yes, this Crimea bridge explosion is a dramatic reminder that this fight is now being taken more and more into Russia and into areas that Russia has annexed or claimed to have annexed. Now, this is a deep strike, and it comes after, we can recall the strikes on the Russian air base in Crimea in August that Ukraine claimed responsibility for. Now, a senior Ukrainian official called this a birthday gift to Putin, and Russia has said such reactions are testimony to the terrorist nature of the Kiev government, as it says, of course. But this is a hit on Putin himself. It was Putin who inaugurated this bridge in 2018, and functionally it has been the most critical supply line to Russian forces in Ukraine. Now, that supply line takes a massive blow, but beyond that, this is a symbolic blow to Russia's claimed annexation of Crimea and to the other areas of Ukraine. The question is now what Russia does next. We certainly can expect some retaliation. Putin could take desperate measures, and desperate could mean nuclear.
Right. It's interesting that you mentioned the word nuclear. How real is the nuclear threat now that a day after Joe Biden, Zelensky has also stated that Putin is preparing his people for a nuclear war?
With nuclear, we'll never know until it's too late, and then maybe we will not either. But without doubt, the threat is serious. Biden said this is the most serious since 1962, and then a day later, Zelensky said that the Russians are preparing their people for a nuclear war. So that's now 3 presidents, the 2 at war and the 3rd who matters more than any other, saying that the nuclear threat is serious. In the face of that, we must believe that it is. It's a sinister reminder that we had from Putin the other day that it was the US that crossed the threshold on the use of a nuclear weapon, and it would therefore not be Russia were it to come to that. It is coming towards that, certainly, and who doesn't hope it stops short? A report in the Times that we saw spoke of a train carrying nuclear weapons being taken to the front. Putin has said that Russia can use all available means to protect Russia, and he has said that these annexed areas are now Russia forever, and we can figure out what that could mean.
Right. Many thanks to you, Sanjay, for bringing us all those ground zero details. And with that, let's now shift our attention over to the UNHRC. Earlier this week, India abstained from voting against China on a draft resolution in the UN Human Rights Council. The draft resolution sought to hold a debate on the human rights situation in China's northwestern Xinjiang province. Remember, it's been alleged that more than 1 million Uyghurs have been detained against their will in a large network of what Beijing calls re-education camps, but have frequently been cited by critics as concentration camps. Also, the recent UN report had concluded that China had committed serious human rights violations, and I'm quoting from that report verbatim, against the Uyghur and other Muslim communities. The draft resolution was turned down after 17 members voted in favor, 19 members voted against, including China, and 11 members abstained, including India. Interestingly, many of those who voted no were Muslim majority countries such as Indonesia, Somalia, Pakistan, UAE, and even Qatar. Let's also listen in to what the Ministry of External Affairs in India has to say regarding India's abstention.
भारत सभी मानवाधिकारों को अपहोल्ड करने के लिए प्रतिबद्ध है। भारत का वोट उसकी लंबे समय के चली आ रही पोजीशन के अनुरूप है कि कंट्री स्पेसिफिक प्रस्ताव कभी मददगार नहीं होते हैं। भारत ऐसे मुद्दों से निपटने के लिए बातचीत के पक्षधर है।
What does this abstention mean for India? Let's try and get in a sense of perspective, and for that I'm joined in by Ambassador G. Parthasarathy, who's a former well-known diplomat. Many thanks to you, Ambassador, for joining in on my show. Now, The MEA has said that country-specific resolutions have never been helpful in dealing with human rights violations around the world. How do you assess India's abstention from the UNHRC vote on Xinjiang?
Well, look, there is certain policy which we follow. What happens, especially in the UN Human Rights Commission, is the Western countries, notably the West Europeans, the United States, and possibly sometimes Japan, who are, work as a group, get together to take on countries of their choice. Now, I'm quite clear in my mind, the United Nations should not be used to satisfy just a group of people, and we'll have to go by the consensus. Now, we generally would like to go along with the regional country, neighbors, what they feel about it. And that is the way we work out our vote, because we should not be seen to be backing just the West and ignoring the neighbors of where these things occur, and ignoring other developing countries. Even the case of Sri Lanka, for example, when we have found that there are some transgressions, we have pointed it out to them, but we will not support Western-sponsored resolutions which have their own initial reasons.
Right, very well said, Ambassador. Also, for a country that has already blocked India's bids at UN to blacklist Pak-based terrorists, experts are questioning, would China be as generous if the UN discussion was about human rights in Kashmir?
Yeah, no, not at all. You have put a very valid point. That would China do something? My answer is that China has a certain stake as a permanent member of the Security Council. India has a stake in sticking to certain principles, and the principle is that you must have a regional sort of sanction to go along with it. None of the regional countries support it. More importantly, this is the thing pertains, human rights violations pertain to a particular community in China. Now, therefore, we go along. You can't be more loyal than the king and then violate a fundamental principle of no voting. As I said, all of us know this, but there has to be a certain basis on which the UN functions and UN organizations function and vote. We will not join a group of nations in this resolution, and most of these countries are doing, these Western countries are doing this just for domestic publicity, while at the same time they will happily trade and call for more. And will they back us?
Right.
When we take up something against China, the answer is no.
Right. Many thanks to you, Ambassador Parthasarathy, for sharing in your precious insights. And with that, we shift our attention over to North Korea. In the last 2 weeks, North Korea has fired 6 missiles, sparking alarm in the region. But North Korea has defended this move, saying its missile testing was a show of self-defense against a possible military threat from the United States. On Tuesday, North Korea had fired a ballistic missile without warning over Japan for the first time in 5 years. Soon after, Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida had condemned this launch and called it outrageous. Now, in response, United States, South Korea and Japan's warships performed a defense exercise in the Sea of Japan. Now, at a Security Council briefing at the UN headquarters, the US blamed Russia and China for emboldening Pyongyang. It should be noted that the US has also cautioned of North Korea's nuclear testing possibilities. One that would be the country's 7th nuclear test and the first in nearly 5 years if it happens. And with that, let's also talk about Iran. The anti-hijab protests in Iran have entered the 3rd week. They were sparked soon after the alleged custodial death of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old who had reportedly worn the hijab incorrectly. Iran's president had called for an investigation into her death after thousands of Iranians had protested on the streets and have been protesting till now. demanding the removal of the morality police. But in the latest, Iran's forensic organization has said that Amini died of an illness and not reported beatings. Analysts have labelled this as a move by the establishment to cover up the atrocities of the morality police. As per reports, over 100 people have died in the protests, and around the world, people are showing their solidarity by cutting off their hair. These include several EU lawmakers and French actresses. So what is happening in Iran? What kind of global ramifications will this have? Let's try and get in a sense of perspective. And for that, I'm joined in by Ivy Josiah, who's a women's rights advocate. Ivy, thank you for joining in on our show today. Also, Mahsa Amini's death has again shifted the spotlight on the religious or morality police. Religious police exist not only in Iran, but several other Islamic nations, including Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, Nigeria, even Sudan. Now, in Iran, they have been established for decades. But what's driving the current wave of opposition by Iranian women?
It was a turning point for this woman, and Mahsa Amini, may she rest in power. When she died, that touched a raw nerve. There was an explosion of anger. And I think this anger and the realization that their regime, that this very cruel regime is not going to change. It's just going to get worse. I think that's driving women. So domestic violence survivors, I find the parallel here when, women, rise up and stand against the abuser, whether it's in the family, but in this case, it's the country, the nation. But I emphasize, I see this happening all over the world. Women are on the rise, the youth are on the rise, and now in Iran, a lot more young people are coming out,
right,
and workers are on the rise.
Very right. In fact, there are schoolgirls now joining these protests. Ivy, why aren't governments in Islamic nations ditching the morality police?
Why would they want to give up a weapon that they can use to have social control? I mean, when you see religious governments that are, that are organized among religious themes, among, but the central legitimacy is coming from religion, the morality police acts like, a force that can create fear, in the people, and somehow it legitimizes them because we are doing it in the name of God. But for me, when I look at the morality police, whether in Malaysia or other parts of the world, for me, the root is toxic masculinity. They want to show we have power, and it's ironical, and it's not surprising to see that it's the men who are doing this, who want to inflict their power on women, inflict the power on, in Malaysia, it's usually when couples are taken away because they have been, doing something illicit or, perhaps holding even something as simple as holding hands. They want to inflict their control of people who don't have that much of power. So the morality police will never be ditched as long as these regimes are in power, because it's their weapon. It's their weapon.
Right, but on an optimistic note, here's hoping that these protests prove to be a turning point in Iran. Many thanks to you, Ivy, for joining in on this discussion. And with that, it's time to slip into a quick break, as we'll be back with more news and updates on World 360.
This is, like, in a nutshell, this is Ramayana as told to a 5-year-old kid. He will understand this much of story. This is the story we have lived with. This is the story we are retelling. This is the story we are showing. So there is not even an iota of deviance from the actual storyline. Nothing of that sort. Am I right, Om?
Absolutely, absolutely. The idea is to recreate Ramayana onto celluloid. The idea is to, and when I say recreate, I don't want anybody to misunderstand, is to change it. Yeah. What I mean to say is translate from the books to celluloid. So this, as I've always said before, that this is not a film for us. This is a representation of our bhakti. This is the representation of our shraddha. This is the representation of everything that we stand for. We are, both of us, and
yes,
most of us.
You have said that this is your passion project. I've read some interviews where you said that this is your passion project. I'm going to get into specifics now because जो ये 90 second का teaser है उस पे हर एक frame पर debate चल रहा है. There is an image of Saif Ali Khan as Ravan who is sitting.
debate चल रहा है.
जी, please आप बोलिए उसके बाद मैं सवाल पूछूंगी.
No, I just wanted to say that not every frame isn't debated because that's not the case. I mean, the dialogue that we had in the trailer, धस जाए धरती चटक जाए आकाश, न्याय के हाथों होकर रहेगा अन्याय का सर्वनाश. आ रहा हूँ मैं अधर्म का विध्वंस करने, आ रहा हूँ न्याय के दो पैरों से अन्याय के 10 सर कुचलने. I think these are the lines which our Manoj ji have written, which are extremely, we are so proud of these lines. We are extremely proud of these lines. And when you see them in the film, it's a huge monologue that Prabhu Shri Ram's character played by Prabhas delivering. These are the things that we want to be proud of. These are the things that we would like to talk about. These are the things that we want to would like to have the conversation with, and not about some things which we don't agree with.
Okay, so then how are you looking at some criticism? Let me ask those criticisms and then we'll go ahead with the conversations that you want this trailer to generate. There is one image of Saif Ali Khan as Ravan who is sitting on a mystic bird. There are scholars, historians who are of the opinion that in Ramayana there is no description that of any kind of bird of this nature.
Sure. So he's demonic, right? He is Mayavi. He is a person who is the greatest villain of all time. He is a demon. He's a 10-headed demon, and you will have to see the film to actually understand that particular point. But he's riding a huge creature, right? And that's his right. And that is a very it's a very negative visual that I see personally as a filmmaker. And when I
Welcome back. You're watching World 360. I'm Akanksha Swaroop. Now, the Nobel Peace Prize for this year has been awarded to one individual and two organizations. The human rights advocate Ales Belyatsky from Belarus, the Russian Human Rights Organization Memorial, and the Ukrainian Human Rights Organization Center for Civil Liberties were announced as the winners by the Norwegian Nobel Committee on Friday. The committee has said that all three had made an outstanding effort to document war crimes, human rights abuses, and the abuse of power.
The Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided to award the Nobel Peace Prize for 2022 to one individual and two organizations. This year's Peace Prize is awarded to human rights advocate Ales Belyatsky from Belarus, the Russian Human Rights Organization Memorial, and the Ukrainian Human Rights Organization Center for Civil Liberties.
Now, CNN's Nina Dos Santos joins me live from London with more details. Nina, this year's Nobel Peace Prize reflects the order of the day and the concerns, particularly in this part of Europe, about a massive authoritarian creep on Europe's eastern flank. Share the details with us.
Well, this year's Nobel Peace Prize, as you'd imagine, very much reflects the order of the day and the concerns, particularly in this part of Europe, about an increasingly aggressive authoritarian creep on Europe's eastern flank. The recipients, one of them came from Belarus, the other one was an organisation from Russia, and the third one was an organisation from Ukraine. That very much reflecting what is happening in these countries. Let's start with Belarus, because Ales Belyatsky is the founder of an organisation called Vyazno, which means spring, that he founded back in the mid to late 90s. That was at the time of constitutional changes that essentially cemented Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus's, cemented his firm grip on power that has remained to this day. Remember, this is a man, Lukashenko, who's often referred to here in Europe as Europe's longest-serving and last dictator. He came up for re-election back in 2020. He was opposed by Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the opposition leader, and then there was a disputed election result that Lukashenko claimed victory on, and since then, Ales Bialyatsky has been back under arrest. So he couldn't physically comment upon having received this award or indeed receive it. He is still in pre-trial detention. The second organisation that received the Nobel Peace Prize this year was Memorial. This is the famous human rights organisation founded right in the end of the 1980s, at the time when communism was crumbling in the USSR, the then USSR, which is now Russia, and it remained active, documenting all of the atrocities of the Soviet era, in particular the murderous purges of Joseph Stalin, but it also documented human rights abuses right the way through until the present day, until at the end of last year it was declared a foreign agent organisation and a Russian court decided to shut it down. Now, in granting this award to Memorial, by the way, on the 70th birthday of the current president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, the Nobel Peace Prize Committee said that what they wanted to do was make sure that Memorial's work was not forgotten. And last but not least, an organisation called the Centre for Civil Liberties, founded in Kiev back in 2007, that has championed democracy in Ukraine and tried to increase transparency, also defending human rights there as well. That was another organisation that was awarded this prize. Obviously, their work now has had to pivot to focus heavily on the allegations of war crimes and human rights abuses that have come to the fore since, of course, Russia began its invasion of Ukraine earlier this year, one which, of course, continues apace.
Right. Many thanks to you, Nina, for sharing all that precious information on the Nobel Peace Prize for us. And with that, let's now shift our attention over to the UK. The new Prime Minister of the UK, Liz Truss, her premiership is in a precarious position. This as a government has announced a series of U-turns on anticipated economic policies, promising growth and higher wages. But critics say her plans do little to help millions of people struggling in the United Kingdom. Even her first speech to the Tories was interrupted by the protesters. Listen in.
And that's why I promised on entering Downing Street to act. Let's get them removed.
And with that, let's now bring you other top stories that have been making news across the world. Let's begin with Elon Musk first. In another surprise move on the Twitter buyout deal, Elon Musk has offered to buy the social media platform for $44 billion, once again going back to his original offer. The World Health Organization has issued an alert over 4 cough syrups manufactured in India after the death of 66 kids in Gambia. India's drugs regulator has ordered an investigation into the alleged contamination of these cough syrups. The US President Joe Biden has pardoned thousands of Americans convicted of marijuana possession on Thursday in a major new step towards destigmatizing the drug. India has countered UK Home Secretary Suella Braverman's claim that the Migration and Mobility Partnership had not worked very well, to say that India had initiated action on all cases raised with the UK under the agreement. South Korea's military appears to want to conscript members of the K-pop supergroup BTS for mandatory military duties, as the public remains sharply divided over whether or not they should be given exemption. Now, Thailand is flying national flags at half-staff to mourn the death of the victims in the tragic nursery massacre. At least 36 people were killed during this massacre, including at least 24 children, in what's believed to be the deadliest mass shooting in the country's history. Thailand's Prime Minister has been at a hospital meeting the survivors. CNN's Anna Corin brings you more as I call it a wrap. Thank you so much for watching.
Sitting in the stifling heat under a corrugated iron roof, A mother is unable to contain her heartache and anguish. Her pain muffled by the collective grief being felt in the province of Nong Bua Lampur in Thailand's northeast, after a disgraced police officer went on the country's most murderous rampage in recent history inside a daycare centre. Of the 36 victims, 24 were children. 4-year-old Dan was one of them. This happy, cheerful little boy was expecting a baby brother in a matter of weeks. His mother barely conscious as she sits with other grief-stricken parents and relatives who've come to register for assistance at the Government Relief Centre just metres away from the scene of the massacre. I can't imagine this kind of person exists, says his grandmother. I can't imagine a human could be this cruel to children. For this couple, clutching each other, their loss is unfathomable. Their 3.5-year-old fraternal twin boys, Wirarap and Warapon, their only children, were slaughtered. Here we see them in the car with their parents just days before their future was horrifically cut short. The father, now speechless, the mother still in shock. They were so talkative. They were at that age where they talked a lot, she explained. They had different characters. They were so lovely. For the emergency crews, the carnage they witness when they walked through the doors is a nightmare they won't ever be able to erase. The first thing I saw when I opened the door, I was stunned. I had to gather myself, he says. I have never seen anything like this before. We are learning gruesome details about what happened at this daycare centre from the first responders who were on the scene. They said that they found the bodies of the children and teachers spread across these 3 rooms, and we can still see the bloodstains splattered across the floor. They said all the bodies had knife wounds to the head. One of the children had tried to protect his face when the attacker wielded the knife, one responder says. He also found 2 children still alive. The first image I saw was children covered with blood, he remembers. I was trying to transport them to the hospital. Some of the kids still had a pulse, but I don't know if they made it. While children's pictures and animal masks decorate the walls, the innocence of this daycare centre has been lost forever. Bloodstains smeared throughout the classrooms, the furniture and abandoned school bags. A ghastly reminder of the horrors and evils unleashed in this refuge for the community's youngest and most treasured. Anna Korin, CNN, Nong Bua Lampur, Thailand.
"24 weeks of unparalleled domination. India's indisputable number 1. CNN News 18 on your side."
Having borne the brunt of cross-border terrorism for decades, India firmly advocates a zero-tolerance approach. In our view, there is no justification for any act of terrorism regardless of motivation, and no rhetoric, however sanctimonious, can ever cover up bloodstains. Look at the whole 370 issue. What was a temporary provision of the Constitution was finally put to rest. This was supposed to be majoritarian. Now tell me, what was happening in Kashmir was not majoritarian?
I'm not to say I'm doing this because it is for counter-terrorism. When you are talking of an aircraft and capability of people, everybody knows where they are deployed and what is the use. You're not fooling anybody by
Hello everyone, you're watching A Billion Ideas with me, Maria Shakil. This Saturday, India's foreign policy is going through a major shift where the government is leveraging the power of a robust economy, a young and thriving democracy, international diaspora, and a rising diplomatic clout to reset the global agenda. India took advantage of the global COVID pandemic to reset the power dynamics as the leading economies of the world stumbled. Through vaccine Maitri and outreach with COVID supplies, India boosted its global position and set the stage to garner international faith in its manufacturing sector to challenge Chinese dominance. In the post-lockdown world, India is now resetting narratives surrounding both domestic and international issues, charting its own path through the India First doctrine. From sending a message to Pakistan, which S. Jaishankar did at the UNGA, flexing its diplomatic muscles with both the US and China, calling for a revamp of the United Nations, to challenging narratives surrounding Kashmir. India's efforts to position itself as an undisputed stakeholder in global affairs were on display during External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar's recently concluded 11-day visit to the United States. He made the case for a confident India that was ready for greater responsibility. Even when it comes to international matters, from the Russian invasion of Ukraine to international condemnation over the persecution of Uyghur Muslims in China, India has championed a middle path, measuring its own strategic interests. Today, we decode the India First doctrine, analyzing both the challenges and opportunities on the world stage. Joining me now is Professor Brahmachelani, Strategic Affairs expert, Ashok Sajanhar, former diplomat, Andrew K.P. Leung is international and independent China strategist based in Hong Kong, and Maximilian Hess is Central Asia Fellow in the Eurasia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He's joining me from London. I'm going to begin with you, Ambassador Sajanhar. Increasingly, what is appearing is that India is speaking its mind clearly and is calling spade a spade, is no longer, holding on to anybody else's narrative. But even in US, for example, the External Affairs Minister went on to say that US should not be thinking that they are fooling the world when it comes to in the context of F-16.
No, you're very right, Maria. And, I would tend to agree with you that there is a greater confidence and boldness as far as India's position is concerned on various issues. India wants to set its own narrative rather than, be supporting some other country, someone else's narrative. And I think this is really borne out, you enunciated a number of reasons, a very strong and vibrant diaspora economy, strong economy. We've been able to handle the COVID pandemic well. We have been able to very nimbly skirt the challenges of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and so on and so forth. But I think in addition to that, we also need to recognize that, India's interests have increased greatly because, as India has grown, both politically, strategically, economically, and diplomatically, its interests have increased. So we need to protect, promote, and safeguard those interests, global interests. That is number one. And I think secondly, also, the world has been passing through this period of turmoil and turbulence. There is so much of confusion, so much of uncertainty. And if we have to safeguard our interests, we have to be nimble-footed. And that is why you find, whether it is Prime Minister Modi, who's, even in the virtual format, he was interacting with all the world leaders. He would go to all the major world, wherever confabulations take place, whether it is the Samarkand Summit or G20 or the other, or COP26. And Jaishankar, as you mentioned, he was in the United States. He was in New York for 7 days.
And right now he is in New Zealand. And I'm going to emphasize a little more on what he said in Washington. And Professor Brahmachelani, come in on this. I'm quoting S. Jaishankar when he says, for someone to say I'm doing this because it is all counter-terrorism content, and so when you are talking of an aircraft like a capability of an F-16 where everybody knows, you know where they are deployed and their use. You are not fooling anybody by saying these things. You know, and we have seen how Pakistan has used these jets, and we know what happened, particularly in the Balakot airstrike, where Pakistan launched F-16s to counter, but one was taken down by MiG-21. But the larger point here is the tone and tonality. Would you say that, you know, all that what was seen in international context and diplomatic space of greater caution, that has been shed when you say that, you know, we know who, you know you're not fooling anybody?
That is true. India is a rising power with an increasing international profile. But despite that, we're seeing President Joe Biden resuming U.S. coddling of Pakistan. The F-16 deal is one manifestation of this U.S. coddling of Pakistan.
Yes.
Biden has not said a word on China's...
There seems to be some problem with that line. Professor Brahmachalani, I'm going to fix that line, and I'll ask my producer to fix that line, and I'm going to come back to you. Okay. Andrew K.P. Leung, how is China and the world viewing India's assertion?
Well, I think that China is long begun to see that the world is become more multipolar. It's no longer dictated by a single hegemon. After the Second World War, for example, the United States-led so-called liberal order reigned supreme. But that is not just the liberal order. For example, under President Trump before, America was able to impose its will on almost all countries or most countries, regardless of the strategic interests of even allies. But now, I think that there is a gradual pushback by those countries who are able to defend their own strategic interests. Secondly, the world is no longer divided into blocks. The idea of blocks against one another no longer works because the whole world has become more interdependent. And so countries do not need to be permanent allies on all things. For example, India, of course, joined the United States in the so-called Quad against China. But it doesn't mean that India needs to go along with Americans' playbook on Russia, for example. So I think that the world is becoming more multipolar, more interconnected, and countries which are able to do so would be able to defend their own interests on single issues without sacrificing the areas for cooperation with other countries.
And is there a sense then, Mr. Hess, that because the situation has changed and it's in this multipolar world, every nation is trying to put its interest as paramount? And that's what is being communicated increasingly. And for India, it can be part of multiple blocks. But when it comes to being part of these blocks, it has always put its interest first. You know, and that is a reality because of what happened in a post-pandemic world that we are living in. There is, and also in the backdrop of a live conflict between Russia and Ukraine.
Well, I think every country always puts its own interest first, or at least the interests of the government in power in less democratic countries. And India certainly is a rising power, but it has been very deft at managing a kind of unique place in international geopolitics for decades now, where it hasn't ever fully aligned with one side, even in the height of the Cold War, although at various points it was more on Moscow's side. Today, I actually would disagree with some of the statements that we're becoming even more multipolar. And I think we certainly have lived in an increasingly multipolar era since the end of the Cold War, and particularly since the rise of China's as a real geoeconomic superpower over the last 20 years. But now we're very quickly seeing a lot of that change, both due to COVID as one factor, and then, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which we're very quickly seeing is making quite clear that Russia is not a geoeconomic power on a global scale that can compete with the U.S. And even China isn't willing to upset the apple cart of the global international economic order to support Russia, which is nominally its closest ally, but in reality, I would say it probably isn't. There certainly are problems in that partnership. It's more of a partnership than a friendship.
But Mr. Hess, why is the world watching India so closely then? It is this deft management, yes, but what has changed so much that is making the world take a note of India, the manner in which just about every country is doing?
I mean, I don't mean to, downplay India's diplomacy. I certainly think Indian diplomacy is a part of it. But because we're at this turning point moment in global history where power relations and power blocks are being reshaped. I mean, we've seen even South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, countries that weren't previously aligned with the sanctions regime against Russia, join them. We're seeing a real potential change in the U.S.-China relationship, as well as concerns over how this interdependence, if there are more tensions in the future, will lead to a far worse geoeconomic conflict there. And India is, of course, the great prize if one side can pull it more to their alignment than the other. And I think that, Indian diplomacy is making the most of that sort of crisis, and there's opportunities that everybody wants something from India now. So India, as it rightfully should, and as one would expect, is going to see what it can get in exchange.
Okay. Professor Brahmachalani, you wanted to finish your point. Please go ahead. And would you say that time has come for India to get permanent membership at the United Nations Security Council, UNSC?
The UN was established on the ruins of a world war.
Yes.
And major reform at the UN is not possible in peacetime. The reform process has stalled for decades. There is no progress on restructuring the UN, making it more meaningful, more effective. In fact, what's happening is that the UN increasingly is getting marginalized in international relations. Look at the UN Security Council. It's gridlocked. There's no way that gridlock can be broken, especially now because of this new Cold War between the US and Russia. So India getting a permanent seat at the UN Security Council is a goal that India will never realize, because the UN is a creature of a world war. And today, some powers might be saying rhetorically that they support India's membership of the UN Security Council. But the fact is that the Security Council can be restructured only by a consensus among all the member states of the UN. So that prospect is distant. What India should be worried about is the fact that the international scene today has become less favorable to India's economic and geostrategic interests. Look at the way India's foreign exchange reserves are getting drained because of the new energy crisis. The energy crisis has been triggered largely by Western sanctions on Russia.
Yes.
And also, India is a major arms importer, and defense imports are also becoming dearer. So India is facing a double whammy: dearer energy imports and dearer defense imports. And then to make things worse, India's neighborhood is becoming more troublesome. And then we have the U.S. under President Joe Biden resuming U.S. coddling of Pakistan. You mentioned the F-16 deal. The F-16 deal is a manifestation of the new U.S. coddling of Pakistan.
But Professor Brahmachalani, talking specifically about the energy crisis, hasn't India managed to communicate to the world? We saw what, as Jaishankar said, and only recently we have heard what the Petroleum Affairs Minister has said in Washington, just 12 hours ago, where he said that India will purchase oil from wherever it wants. So it has nothing to do with the countries deciding whether India will be purchasing from Russia or any of the countries. India will decide depending on its requirement and what it thinks is best for it.
that is true. India has stepped up its purchases of Russian oil. But Russian oil, despite the stepped up imports, makes up only about 10 to 12% of India's total oil requirements. India is the world's third largest consumer of oil after the US and China.
Yes.
And gas imports have become dearer for India. Oil imports have become dearer for India. Given the cost considerations that stare at India, and if this war in Ukraine prolongs, which is a real possibility, then India would be faced with hard choices next year. So the geoeconomic and the geostrategic environment are becoming less favorable for India's interests.
The point being made here, Ambassador Sarjanhar, about challenges that India faces going forward. S. Jaishankar, who is on his first visit to New Zealand as External Affairs Minister, has said, and I'm quoting him, that it was natural that different countries in the context of Ukraine will react differently, and different regions would react a little differently. The people would view it from their viewpoint, their immediate interest and historical experiences, their insecurities. This is the view that India has maintained vis-a-vis its stand, where it has condemned the war, but it has also said that it will not take a position in favor of Ukraine or in favor of Russia or against Russia particularly. When we look at the crisis which is there at hand, and the equation particularly in the context of rupee and dollar, but would you also not say that vis-a-vis dollar, there are other countries, other currencies have bigger challenges, and India is really holding on to its own? The rupee is holding well.
Yes, thank you very much, Maria. I think you have put it very clearly. This is the issue, not only with the rupee. It is not an issue only with the economy of India. It is a problem that the whole world is confronting. As we were discussing earlier, even as far as the COVID-19 pandemic is concerned, it is not only India that is handling these challenges. But I think the point to be noted here is that India has managed to handle these challenges much better than most other countries. I will say, I think India has stood out as a beacon of hope for the world. While, there is so much of confusion, so much of volatility, so much of disorder around the world. And even in our northern neighbor, you look at the zero COVID policy, etc., what it is doing as far as the lockdowns are concerned, even as far as the economy is concerned. Even today, during the, whether it is the pandemic or it is the war, India has stood out. It has, that is why it is a partner of choice. That is why it has become an indispensable partner for all countries, on different sides of the divide, where you want to deal with international challenges, global challenges, whether it's climate change, terrorism, healthcare, education, you name it. And I think India has to be on that high table, because I think India has acquitted itself most creditably. And particularly, you mentioned about the rupee-dollar exchange rate. You look at the manner in which all the other currencies, they have slided as compared to India. And India has, said that we respect the UN Charter, the UN principle, territorial integrity, sovereignty, etc. So we have been fully in favor of that. And as
and Ambassador Sarjanhar, increasingly India has challenged the grouping itself. I mean, the relevance of UN and its hypocrisy and diplomacy in these times as well. I have just enough time for Andrew K.P. Leong. Mr. Leong, India at multiple groupings, if you look at Quad or several others, why is it that these countries are looking at India as the destination to be as far as Asia is concerned?
Well, of course, the profile of India is rising. For example, India recently took part in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is, of course, is a different bloc, if you like, outside the United States-dominated West. And of course, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization encompasses a great deal of the more powerful countries in the developing world. Now, as I said, the whole world order has been changing quite significantly in the sense that the developing world is going to account for more than 50% of the world economy by the year 2030, according to the latest study of the OECD. So I think India is trying to catch this kind of paradigm shift, as indeed China and other countries.
Okay. And Mr. Hess, the West, the way it looks at India, and even in the context of F-16, you heard what as Jaishankar said, and there has been also a message that has been communicated by Defense Minister Rajnath Singh to his US counterpart Lloyd Austin, that India's concerns over Washington's decision to provide a sustenance package for Pakistan's F-16 fleet. So India is saying that we know why you're making these deals.
Well, I think the reason why India is being so particularly vocal about this is it comes at where there's a particular change in the balance. As we were discussing earlier, India hasn't really sat in one block or the other, but for a lot of its military hardware, it has been very much dependent on Russia, whereas Pakistan has primarily been dependent on the United States for their military hardware. Because of the sanctions environment on Russian arms, that is, and the damage to Russia's own arms industry that we're seeing, evident as a result of this war and how it's not quite all that it is promised to be, that risks creating a potential imbalance in power then if the United States supplies newer and more advanced technology to Pakistan, whereas of course the United States wants to convince India to stay in line with these sanctions, to comply with them. But on that, I would just rebut one point that was made earlier. Russia has used its energy supplies as a weapon for decades before there were any sanctions on it. So, the primary cause of these issues is Russia's economic war alongside its war in Ukraine, not the sanctions in itself.
Yes, so the world is taking note of India First doctrine of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, its opportunities and ramifications we have just discussed on this show. Professor Brahmachalani, Ashok Sajanhar, Andrew Kyopiluang and Maximilian Hess, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. And that's all from me. I'll be seeing you next week with another episode of A Billion Ideas. Thanks so much for watching. From the book Ramayana. The reason why I'm saying is क्योंकि अभी जो अरुण गोविल का एक वीडियो वायरल हुआ था, that is India's connect to Lord Ram. और यहाँ पर जो डिपिक्शन है उसके बारे में सवाल उठ रहा है और बोला जा रहा है ये कंप्लीट डिविएशन है और फेथ के साथ छेड़छाड़ किया गया है.
Okay, first of all, not even 1% of our film is deviation from the actual Ramayana. जब हम रामायण की बात करते हैं, what comes to our mind and what have you seen in the teaser? रामायण क्या है? रामायण एक कथा है जिसमें द डेविल किंग, द डीमन किंग, रावण, वो हमारी माँ सीता का हरण कर लेते हैं. भगवान राम माँ सीता को बचाने जाते हैं, समुद्र पे पुल बांधते हैं, वो वानर सेना की, सुग्रीव की और बजरंगबली हनुमान की सहायता लेते हैं. दिस इज like in a nutshell, this is Ramayana as told to a 5-year-old kid. He will understand this much of story. This is the story we have lived with. This is the story we are retelling. This is the story we are showing. So there is not even an iota of deviance from the actual storyline. Nothing of that sort. Am I right, Om?
Absolutely, absolutely. The idea is to recreate Ramayana onto celluloid. The idea is to and when I say recreate, I don't want anybody to misunderstand, is to change it. Yeah. What I mean to say is translate from the books to celluloid. So this, as I've always said before, that this is not a film for us. This is a representation of our bhakti. This is the representation of our shraddha. This is the representation of everything that we stand for. We are and both of us and
yes,
most of us.
You have said that this is your passion project. I've read some interviews where you said that this is your passion project. I'm going to get into specifics now because जो ये 90 second का teaser है उस पे हर एक frame पर debate चल रहा है. There is an image of Saif Ali Khan as Ravan who is sitting.
debate चल रहा है.
जी, please आप बोलिए उसके बाद मैं सवाल पूछूंगी.
No, I just wanted to say that not every frame is debated because that's not the case. I mean, the dialogue that we had in the trailer, धस जाए धरती चटक जाए आकाश, न्याय के हाथों होकर रहेगा अन्याय का सर्वनाश. आ रहा हूँ मैं अधर्म का विध्वंस करने, आ रहा हूँ न्याय के दो पैरों से अन्याय के 10 सर कुचलने. I think these are the lines which our Manoj ji have written, which are extremely, we are so proud of these lines. We are extremely proud of these lines. And when you see them in the film, it's a huge monologue that Prabhu Shri Ram's character played by Prabhas delivering. These are the things that we want to be proud of. These are the things that we would like to talk about. These are the things that we want to would like to have the conversation with, and not about some things which we don't agree with.
Okay, so then how are you looking at some criticism? Let me ask those criticisms and then we'll go ahead with the conversations that you want this trailer to generate. There is one image of Saif Ali Khan as Ravan who is sitting on a mystic bird. There are scholars, historians who are of the opinion that in Ramayana there is no description that of any kind of bird of this nature.
Sure. So he's demonic, right? He is Mayavi. He is a person who is the greatest villain of all time. He is a demon. He's a 10-headed demon, and you will have to see the film to actually understand that particular point. But he's riding a huge creature, right? And that's his right. And that is a very it's a very negative visual that I see personally as a filmmaker. And when I talk about when I talk about a really ruthless, a demon king called Ravan, I see him riding that obnoxious creature. एक दुराचारी, एक दुष्ट प्रवृत्ति का ऐसा ये किरदार है रावण हमारे इतिहास का. और ये दुष्ट प्रवृत्ति का किरदार जो है वो जिस पर सवार होके आ रहा है वो भी एक खौफनाक और नेगेटिविटी से भरा हुआ ऐसा ये क्रीचर है.
So from mustache to beard, इस पर जो जी go ahead, Manoj ji go ahead. हाँ.
जी, because I was just trying to say that who doesn't know, I mean, how a Pushpak Viman would look like. I mean, you do not need Manoj Muntashir or Om Raut to really tell you how a Pushpak Viman.
Hello and welcome to Now Showing. I'm Atika Faruqi. How is this festive season going for you? I'm sure you've been watching good cinema and dancing to good songs, reading good books and meeting with interesting people. I went from pillar to post to get you some really nice people and conversations in this episode. So let's start with the highlights. Nazarandaz is a slice of life film with a few faults in writing. It boasts of Kumud Mishra's outstanding performance. Riding high on the success of their latest big screen outing, Vikram Vedha, Hrithik Roshan and Saif Ali Khan are singing praises about the making of the film. Jackie Shroff, Pankaj Tripathi and actor Aditya Gupta talk all things legal on the show Criminal Justice. Tiska Chopra, Rajesh Telang and Mukesh Tiwari speak about telling stories from small town India. And Shri Valli composer DSP talks about his new song and language war. Is there a war at all? So let's talk about this week's film, Nazarandaz. I watched this film and it's a slice of life film about a man who lives alone and has been visually impaired since birth. With two random people in his staff whom he has recently found, he travels to his birthplace to reconnect with his childhood. In the process, he gives a few lessons to these two unprivileged people, Divya Datta and Ali played by Abhishek Banerjee. He also reconnects with his childhood love played by Rajeshwari Sachadev, who is outstanding in this extended cameo.
एक दूसरे का साथ देना और एक दूसरे के साथ जिंदगी बिताना दोनों में फर्क होता है.
The very brilliant Kumud Mishra, who plays this man so authentically without letting the viewer think for a second that he is acting.
मैं फ्लाइट और ट्रेन में बंद होके नहीं जा सकता.
It's a class in performance where an actor lets go of the insecurities of how he is looking on screen to perform a role that becomes so heartwarming that you see no shortcoming in that person because the zest for life, pride in oneself and independence of daily living is endearing. The star of the film is certainly Kumud Mishra.
हाथ पकड़ो मदद के इंतजार की आदत नहीं डालनी चाहिए वरना सड़क के उस तरफ ही खड़े रह जाओगे
Story by director Vikrant Deshmukh and the producer Lakshman Utekar, who by the way has also produced Mimi and has been an avid cinematographer, is a beautiful thought. Screenplay and dialogues by Rishi Virmani can be credited with some of the best punch lines that I have heard in the recent past, and one-liners and humorous bits of words that really make you laugh. The team has made an earnest, honest film that can be enjoyed with the whole family, and also while celebrating life, tugs at your attention towards the people who cannot see. What's their fault? How do they manage without eyes? The tiny problem though is with the writing of the film.
नमस्ते वकील साहब मेरी वसीयत के कागजात प्लीज जल्दी से बनवा दीजिए
The story on paper had a lot of potential to be a truly deep and a very meaningful and a moving film. Also, the story shifts track between who is it about, the blind old man alone or the three men on the journey. The lack of a backstory, particularly of Kumud Mishra, hampers the connect between the character and the viewer. And the journey from Mumbai to Mandvi could have been cinematically been captured with a lot of variety. But there is that one scene where Kumud is taken to a place with white sand and shining stars in the sky in the background where he can run. It's beautiful. This scene with Rajeshwari was so romantic and so deep and so meaningful that I was just glaring at that.